For 26 years, from the storming of the Bastille in Paris on July 14, 1789, to the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, Europe and large parts of the world were absorbed in the repercussions of this upheaval. In today's lesson, you are going to learn about the causes and the outcome of the French Revolution. There were many causes of the French Revolution, and it's difficult to pinpoint which of the causes was the most significant. The Third Estate struggled under the oppression, and many ordinary French families were being increasingly burdened by taxes. In the years before 1789, these families had to deal with a harvest crisis, which led to the price of food rising. The Enlightenment ideals of rights and freedoms were also spilling into the public sphere, and many actually began to doubt and question the legitimacy of the old regime. On top of all this, the monarch, Louis XVI at the time, was considered to be a bit of a buffoon, though he was generally liked. He and his ministers were struggling to come up with a way to pull France out of the tight financial situation. Louis XVI seemed to face one crisis after another during his reign. The nobility objected to many of his ideas or requests. One of the reasons was that they weren't happy with the continuing centralization, meaning the bulk of the government power being moved into the hands of the king and his ministers and being less influenced by tradition and the nobility. There was a time in France's history when someone who was wealthy in the Third Estate could purchase the title of a noble and then climb the ranks. Similarly, someone with talents in the church, let's say, could actually rise to the ranks of the clergy. Unfortunately, though, by 1788, French society was becoming increasingly less mobile. It was becoming more and more difficult for Frenchmen in the Third Estate, no matter how intelligent, talented, or wealthy, to move up. So, the nobility and the clergy were proving to be rather difficult to work with. Louis XVI could not get them to allow him to increase royal revenues. Absolutism had failed, obviously, because if the nobility and clergy adhered to absolutist rule, they would listen to the king absolutely. So Louis XVI calls the Estates General to meet at Versailles, which is his palace, in May of 1789. The Estates were encouraged to write up a list of grievances, or as they were called then, cahiers. The cahiers had a variety of issues. From the First and Second Estate, the majority of complaints were related to the government and political philosophy. The Third Estate often wrote about the troubles they faced in their daily lives. They also wrote about not having their rights abused, seeing an end to tax exemptions as well. In a famous pamphlet, a priest, Sieyès, who is pictured above on the slide, actually attacked the privilege of his own estate and demanded reform. His pamphlet defined a nation as the sum of everyone in it. First and Second Estate wanted to meet as the Estates General used to in the olden days, where each estate would get one vote, leaving the first two estates to constantly have the ability to outvote the Third Estate. The Third Estate, on the other hand, wanted themselves to be allowed to have as many representatives as the other two estates combined, and then to vote by individual. This perfectly reflects the clash of the ideals of the old regime and the Enlightenment. When King Louis XVI failed to get the First and Second Estates to compromise, the Third Estate declared itself a national assembly. In response to that, Louis locks them out of the Estates General. Because Louis had locked them out of the meeting hall, the confused representatives of the Third Estate moved into a nearby indoor tennis court. Within the court, the members made a vow to continue to meet until France had a constitution. Unfortunately, while major movements were being made politically, more riotous movements were being made in many cities. Tensions were incredibly high throughout France. In many cities, bread riots were becoming common. People were going hungry, and riots, which were often led by women who were unable to feed their families, were a reflection of people's desperation. In July, a mob stormed the Bastille, which was a prison in Paris that came to symbolize royal power, and actually killed several soldiers. Louis had little choice but to actually acknowledge the Third Estate, or now as they're called, the National Assembly. It was this violence that actually saved the existence of the National Assembly and made it more legitimate. This violence, or at least the threat of violence, would be ever present in the French Revolution. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen became the creed of the Revolution. This document was a statement of principle and of hope. It reflected the ideas of the Enlightenment. You can read two statements from the Declaration on this slide. Another key statement said, "The principle of all sovereignty rests essentially in the nation. Nobody and no individual may exercise authority which does not emanate from the nation expressly. It seems like a shift is about to occur in a nation that has been so long ruled by absolutism. The National Assembly concerned itself with equality of all Frenchmen before the law. It also applied freedom to the economic sphere, meaning many privileges of the first and second estate were now eradicated. French people could pursue any trade they wanted, regardless of how they were born. The National Assembly also sought to reform the church. In July 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy was passed. All church lands, which were very expansive, were nationalized and put up for sale. France was divided into 83 districts called départements, where one person was elected to take care of laws, taxes, education, and poor relief. A major shift in thinking as a result of the French Revolution was the idea that in the modern state there was only one loyalty: to the nation itself. Edmund Burke was an Englishman who had supported the American Revolution that had happened earlier. Burke was happy about the ideals of the French Revolution, but he thought the French were going about it in a bad way. By going too quickly, they would destroy the natural organism that was a society. Thomas Paine, who was another Englishman, criticized Burke for being so concerned about tradition. Paine was more inclined to side with the people over a government. Paine said that Burke pities the plumage but forgets the dying bird. He's upset to see the wreckage, not realizing that there are people in France who are suffering. The Estates General was dissolved, and the Third Estate was now in charge as a National Assembly. It was time to get to work on rebuilding France. In the new Legislative Assembly, which met in October 1791, many groups appeared that weren't necessarily political parties, but who were united in their aims. Two of the most important groups were the Girondins and the Jacobins. The Girondins, named after the Gironde in southern France, felt that the new order in France ought to be universal, not just in France. The Jacobins, named after the monastery where they met, were unhappy with the halfway nature of the revolution. They wanted the constitutional monarchy that the National Assembly had established in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen to be turned into a republic. As you can see, some groups at the Legislative Assembly felt that the revolution was coming to an end, while others were thinking that it was just beginning. The Legislative Assembly faced many additional problems. With the economy in disorder and food shortages in many areas, there was unrest among peasants and urban workers. The monarchs of Europe were making threatening statements as well, and many members of the Assembly believed that those who had emigrated out of France to avoid the revolution were actually planning to come back and overthrow the revolution. The Legislative Assembly also had to figure out what to do with their king. Back on June 20th, 1791, Louis XVI and his family attempted to flee to Austria, but they were apprehended at the border and arrested. It's worth pausing for a minute and reflecting on the king and his queen. Louis XVI had married Marie Antoinette when they were both very young, by our standards at least. He was only 15 and Marie was only 14. Louis attempted to be involved in France's finances, but the results left heavy taxes on the shoulders of the Third Estate. His wife was seen as being sympathetic with France's enemies, and people also accused her of living a life of pure luxury and not caring about the needs of France's people, which is why she is inaccurately identified as saying, "Let them eat cake," when she was told that there was not enough bread for the people. The reality is that both Marie and Louis loved luxury. Marie loved fashion and gambling, and Louis was born and raised in one of the most impressive castles, Versailles. Take a second to look up the Palace Versailles, and you'll be so impressed with how ornate it is. They were forcibly removed from their castle and brought down to the level of the people in France. Eventually, they were both executed. Despite being militarily unprepared, France decided to declare war on any European power that was against the revolution. It became the crusade for the revolutionaries. The Legislative Assembly was not governing successfully, and that became clear when a group of people from Paris revolted against the constitutional monarchy. They arrested the king and demanded that a convention be established to write a new constitution based on the principle that all people are equal. So, similar to the principles of the first revolution, however, there is now a difference in that the leaders are pushing and they're prepared, rather, to push the application even further. Though the Jacobins were the leaders, the Second Revolution was actually brought on because of a group called the Sans-Culottes. You can see a sans-culotte on this slide. Sans-culotte means without breeches, and it was just about the way they dressed. This was a small minority in France that were considered to be the unpredictable and sometimes irrational group during the French Revolution. Anyway, this time around, the Third Estate could not agree on the nature of the new order. This resulted in the suspension of the monarchy and the assembling of the National Convention. The Girondins were in charge of the war, which was not going well, which made them lose popularity, and thus the Jacobins began to gain popularity. The National Convention had to decide what to do with the king. Jacobins wanted to execute him, the Girondins wanted to hold off on making a decision. However, Louis was in fact tried, he was convicted, and he and Marie were both executed. The Jacobins secured control of the convention. The Jacobins also needed to cope with the war and deal with those who they thought were opposing them. They suspended the constitutional government, ruling by emergency decree. They set up the Committee of Public Safety to protect the state. They enacted conscription, making all Frenchmen, whether at home or in the army, young or old, to assist in the war effort. Robespierre was a lawyer and a politician who represented the Third Estate. Later, he becomes the leader of the Jacobins. He and the Jacobins completely remodeled France. France got a new national education system. They made a new calendar and actually said that the year was now year one. They also got a new flag, as you can see right here, the tricolor flag, replacing the old fleur-de-lis. You can see here in this picture an example of the calendar that they created. And with the new calendar, they were saying that the first year of the Republic was now year one. They also wanted everyone to be conformed. There were no differences between the classes. People were expected to dress the same, talk the same, read the same books, sing the same songs. They even created that flag, as I showed you earlier, as a way to have a symbol to unite them all. Any enemies who were, people who were unhappy about the Republic, who wrote out against it, spoke out against it, or those who were guilty of treason were executed very quickly using the guillotine. And it was effective because you can go through so many people. In fact, the Jacobins had tens of thousands of people executed during their reign, hence the time period being called the Terror. Take a minute to read through this quote. It comes from the revolutionary song that people sang during this time. It's now the national anthem of France. You could tell by the words being used that they really felt like they were on a mission to get rid of any enemies, anyone who opposed their new task. The Jacobins eventually have their power taken away. Robespierre himself is executed by the guillotine, which I find to be quite ironic. France was now controlled by a Republican center that was made up of 5 directors chosen from 2 houses of parliament. They drew up a new constitution that focused on a complicated balance of power in the hopes of avoiding another Jacobin terror situation. Unfortunately, the Directory had enemies in every corner and no one was happy. They even had to call on the army on several occasions for assistance. In one case, they called upon a very young general, Napoleon Bonaparte, to help, but you're going to read more about him later on. The new centralized state demanded complete loyalty from its citizens, insisting on obedience while being passionate about the nation. This sweeping statement here that says, in 10 years France did away with 1,000 years of history, indicates how deep the changes were that were brought about by the revolution. The changes were deep and dramatic. Many later revolutions that will be studied in this course were actually inspired by the French Revolution. However, the debate over whether or not it accomplished good continues.